Do all humans share a psychic stratum? Greetings mortals, and capital day to you all. I'm your host Simon, welcoming you back to the library of Gnosis. Animals have instincts, like dogs marking their territory or birds making nests. Humans are no different. We all share certain instincts, or archetypes as Jung referred to them. The collective unconscious is a term coined by Carl Jung and refers to structures of the unconscious mind which are shared among beings of the same species, a kind of primordial or archaic memory. According to Jung, the human collective unconscious is populated by instincts and archetypes, universal symbols such as the Great Mother, the Wise Old Man, the Shadow, the Tower, Water, the Tree of Life, and many more. Jung considered the collective unconscious to underpin and surround the unconscious mind, distinguishing it from the personal unconscious of Freudian psychoanalysis. He argued that the collective unconscious had a profound influence on the lives of individuals who lived out its symbols and clothed them in meaning through their experiences. These primordial images, or archetypes as Jung calls them, belongs to the basic stock of the unconscious psyche and cannot be explained as personal acquisition. Together they make up the psychic stratum, which has been called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual. The collective unconscious, so far as we can say anything about it at all, appears to consist of mythological motives and primordial images, for which reason the myths of all nations are its real exponents. In fact, the whole of mythology could be taken as a sort of projection of the collective unconscious. We can therefore study the collective unconscious in two ways, either in mythology or in the analysis of the individual. The structure of the psyche, collected works of Carl Jung. These archetypes have found their way into all walks of life. Within religions and folklore, these archetypes reveal themselves. From elves to Santa Claus, from Buddhism to Christianity. Most people are accustomed to these archetypes as they appear in cultural media like movies, which is not surprising, as media is a reflection of the culture they are born within. The collective unconscious is a universal datum. That is, every human being is endowed with this psychic archetype layer since his or her birth. One cannot acquire this strata by education or other conscious effort because it is innate. We may also describe it as a universal library of human knowledge, or the sage in man, the very transcendental wisdom that guides mankind. Jung stated that the religious experience must be linked with the experience of these archetypes of the collective unconscious. Thus, God himself is lived like a psychic experience of the path that leads one to the realization of his or her psychic wholeness. The most important of all is the self, which is the archetype of the center of the psychic person, his or her totality or wholeness. The center is made of the unity of conscious and unconscious reached through the individuation process. One of the symbols Jung used to represent the self was a circle with a dot in the center. The central dot represents the ego, whereas the self can be said to consist of the whole with the center dot. It is also interesting to note that the circle dot was used by the Pythagoreans and later Greeks to represent the first metaphysical being, the monad or absolute, or simply what we might call God. The idea that there are two centers of the personality distinguished Jungian psychology at one time. The ego has been seen as the center of consciousness, whereas the self is defined as the center of the total personality, which includes consciousness, the unconscious, and the ego. The self is both the whole and the center, while the ego is the self-contained center of the circle, contained within the whole. The self can be understood as the greater circle. In this way, there arises a consciousness which is no longer imprisoned in the petty, oversensitive, personal world of the ego, but participates freely in the wider world of objective interests. This widened consciousness is no longer that touchy, egotistical bundle of personal wishes, fears, hopes, and ambitions, which always has to be compensated or corrected by unconscious counter-tendencies. Instead, it is a function of relationship to the world of objects, bringing the individual into the absolute, binding and indissoluble communion with the world at large. The function of the unconscious, CV. Actually, Jung's choice of the term archetype is in some sense misleading, for in the late Platonic tradition, the archetypes constitute a total spiritual reality, the original perfect spiritual reality or realities which generates the imperfect physical realities, the thoughts in the mind of God, of Stoicism and Platonic Christianity. For Jung, then, the collective unconscious is not, as many of his popularizers claim, a kind of universal mind or metaphysical reality like the Platonic world of forms, but rather an ultimately biological reality. The spiritual concepts of Platonism are not seen as metaphysical but biological, or rather psychobiological. If you want to learn more about the world of forms, I will put a card up at the top. The term archetype occurs as early as Philo-Judaeus, with references to the imago Dei, or God image in man. It can also be found in Irenaeus, who says, quote, "The creator of the world did not fashion these things directly from himself, but copied them from archetypes outside of himself." In the Corpus Hermeticum, God is called the archetypical light. The term occurs several times in the Gnosis, the Areopagite, as for instances in the De Caelesti Hierarcha 2, or immaterial archetypes, and in the De Divinis Nobinimus, the archetypal stone. The term archetype is not found in St. Augustine, but the idea of it is. Thus, in the De Verse Questionibus, he speaks of idea principales, which are themselves not formed, contained in the divine understanding. Archetype is an explanatory paraphrase of the Platonic eidos. For our purposes, this term is apposite and helpful, because it tells us that so far as the collective unconscious content are concerned, we are dealing with archaic, or I would say primordial types, that is, with universal images that have existed since the remote times. The term representations collective used by Levi-Broll to denote the symbolic figures in the primitive view of the world could easily be applied to the unconscious content as well, since it means practically the same thing. Another well-known expression of the archetypes is myth and fairy tale, but here too we are dealing with forms that have received a specific stamp and have been handed down through long periods of time. The term archetype thus applies only indirectly to representation collectives, since it designates only those psychic content which have not yet been submitted to conscious elaboration and are therefore an immediate datum of psychic experience. From archetypes of the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious shares another trait, the connection between every individual to each other. Underlying this is the written and oral history we share, built upon by billions of our kind through countless years. We like to think of ourselves as a separate being from everything else, but we have the knowledge of so many past lives contained within us, past iteration of ourselves. Plato said that all learning is remembering. We are reborn again to relearn what we have discovered in our previous lives. Whatever your own conclusion on reincarnation may be, it is undoubtedly true in a very real sense that we build upon the knowledge of our previous iteration of being. In The Significance of Constitution and Heredity in Psychology, November 1929, Jung wrote, "And the essential thing, psychologically, is that in dreams, fantasies, and other exceptional states of mind, the most far-fetched mythological motives and symbols can appear autochronously at any time, often apparently as the result of particular influences, traditions, and excitations working on the individual, but more often without any sign of them. These primordial images, or archetypes, as I have called them, belong to the basic stock of the unconscious psyche and cannot be explained as personal acquisition. Together, they make up the psychic stratum which has been called the collective unconscious. The existence of a collective unconscious means that individual consciousness is anything but a tabula rasa and is not immune to predetermining influences. On the contrary, It is in the highest degree influenced by inherited presuppositions, quite apart from the unavoidable influences exerted upon it by the environment. The collective unconscious compromises itself in the psychic life of our ancestors right back to the earliest beginnings. It is the matrix of all conscious psychic occurrences, and hence it exerts an influence that compromises the freedom of the consciousness in the highest degree, since it is continually striving to lead all consciousness process back into old paths. On October 19, 1936, Jung delivered a lecture, The Concept of the Collective Unconscious, to the Abernathian Society at St. Baron's Hospital in London. He said, "My thesis then is as follows. In addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature, and which we believe to be the only empirical psyche, even if we tack on the personal unconscious as an appendix, there exists a second psychic system of collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals. This collective unconscious does not develop individually, but is inherited. It consists of pre-existent forms, the archetypes, which can only become conscious secondarily and give definitive form to certain psychic contents." Jung linked the collective unconscious to what Freud called archaic remnants, mental forms whose present cannot be explained by anything in the individual's own life, and which seem to be aboriginal, innate, and inherited shapes of the human mind. He credited Freud for developing his primordial horde theory and totem and taboo, and continued further with the idea of an archaic ancestor maintaining his influence in the minds of present-day humans. "Every human being," he wrote, quote, "however high his consciousness development, is still an archaic man at the deeper levels of his psyche." As modern humans go through the process of individuation, moving out of the collective unconscious into a mature self, they establish a persona, which can be understood simply as that small portion of the collective psyche which they embody, perform, and identify with. The collective unconscious exerts overwhelming influence on the minds of individuals. These effects, of course, vary widely. However, since they involve virtually every emotion and situation, at times the collective unconscious can terrify, but it can also heal. Animals and plants are a part of the collective unconscious. You could think of the spectrum from the conscious to unconscious in terms of differentiation and individualization. At the latter end of the spectrum, you have more of a sense of I. We share certain individualized emotional traits with animals. For example, at times we have the loyalty of a dog, the cunning of a fox, and the harmlessness of a deer. That is why we have so many theomorphical animal form symbols in dreams, and why in personality types, astrology makes generous use of animal symbols. If you do yoga, also ponder the animal poses and their effects. Birds are more emblematic of the freedom afforded by our mental nature, the ability to soar, to quickly go distances with our mind. Plants are a still, quote, lower substratum. Animals depend on plants as we do on animals. Trees signify a vast timescale. In dreams, a tree can symbolize the slow, deliberate process which finds fulfillment with age and wisdom. Their age in comparison with humans also indicate the height you can reach by patience. You cannot speed up a tree's progress much, nor should you. Insects denote the rabid and rapid infection of thoughts and emotions. Think how isms spread below the threshold of serious reflection. Rocks are at the lowest stratum, but they denote the first principles, strength, adamant physical and spiritual law. So, what do you think, mortal? Do we all share a collective unconscious? And just exactly what does this entail? Leave it down in the comment section below. Thank you for listening. See you next time, mortal. Remember to hit that bell button, subscribe for more Red Pill content. Do give it a like if you enjoyed it. And if you learned anything, please feel free to share it to spread Gnosis. If you want to support my work, you can find me on Patreon at Library of Gnosis. You can find me on YouTube, Facebook, and Bitchute at Library of Gnosis. The audio versions of my broadcasts are available on Spotify under the same name.